Hi Saints, this is Kent once again, going through another recap video for our Sermon on the Mount Bible study. This one's for the 7th meeting that we had, and we were going over Matthew chapter 5, and we started in verse 21. If you'll remember, last time we talked about these commandments when Jesus said, whoever annuls one of the least of these commandments. We talked about how that was talking about the commandments that he himself was about to give in the Sermon on the Mount. And so here in verse 21, it's really the first of those commandments that he's talking about that he's giving to his disciples. And like we mentioned, he starts with comparing or even really contrasting what he's saying for his disciples against what the Old Testament, what Moses said for the nation of Israel. So he starts in 5 verse 21, in 5 verse 21, talking about the commandment regarding murder. He says, "You have heard that it was said to the ancients, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." And at the study, we spent a good bit of time looking at Deuteronomy chapter 19, and we don't have time to do that now, but basically it just gives the outline of what the law of Israel was concerning how they prosecuted murder. So if someone killed somebody, if he said it was an accident or said it was on purpose, he was going to be tried for the crime to see whether or not it was murder or whether it was, an accident, something less than murder. And so when he would, say someone was, in Deuteronomy 19, it gives the example of someone using an axe, and the axe head slips off the end of the handle and it hits his neighbor and it kills him. If he says, well, it was an accident, he flees to a city of refuge. The judges will try the case, and if he's found guilty, meaning no, it wasn't an accident, you actually committed murder, he would, in Deuteronomy 19, it says they would hand him over to the avenger of blood, which it doesn't say who that is, but we kind of infer that it was probably someone from the victim's family, and it was their responsibility to put the murderer to death. But if he was innocent, then of course he wouldn't be put to death. And so what the Lord is saying in verse 21 there is that whoever murders will be liable to judgment. There was going to be a judgment. It wasn't like, well, the person who died was a peasant, so it doesn't matter, or the person who killed the other person was the king, so we don't need to punish him. No, whoever murders will be liable to judgment, which was something unique to the nation of Israel, that everybody was held to the same legal standard, and that, showing how valuable and precious God saw human life as being. And so when Jesus goes on to explain what he says, we'll notice that what was true regarding murder in the Old Testament, you're going to be liable to judgment. And if it turns out you really did commit murder, you were going to be executed. Jesus says there's going to be a judgment similar, but not for murder, but for anger. So listen to what he says. And this is in Matthew 5:22. We'll just look at the first little section. But I say to you, remember, these commandments, Jesus is telling his disciples what his commandments are. And under the law, it said, whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Now, it's important to notice that he doesn't necessarily say guilty. He says liable to judgment. Similar to in the Old Testament, if somebody died at your hand, it doesn't necessarily mean you committed murder and you were going to be liable to judgment. They were going to judge you based on the facts of the case, looking at the evidence. Well, Jesus says that same thing's true about your anger. When you are angry with your brother, you're going to be held accountable, and by Jesus, by the one who sees into the thoughts and intentions of your heart. There will be a day where you stand before him and he will judge you based on how you felt in your heart towards your brother. That doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're angry, you're going to be found guilty. Doesn't mean that just because you're angry, you are in sin. We know, according to the book of James, the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. But there are times where man is angry, and it's not the wrath of man, but rather it's righteous anger. It's the anger of God, and you'll be vindicated. We don't have time to look at them now, but at our study we looked at two examples from the life of Moses one where he was at Sinai and he was angry at the people because of their idolatry, and he was extremely angry, but God vindicated him because it wasn't the wrath of man. It wasn't just Moses angry at the people, but God was angry, and he vindicates Moses. But there was another story where he was at Meribah, and the people were grumbling, and they wanted water. And Moses was really frustrated with them over it, but it doesn't seem like God necessarily was, at least not to the extent Moses was. So when Moses says to the people, "Shall we bring water for you from this rock?" and he strikes the rock with his stick when the Lord had just told him to speak to the rock, God severely disciplines Moses because he was showing anger, representing it as though it was the anger of God, but it wasn't. It was the wrath of man. It was the anger of Moses. And so what Jesus is telling his disciples is, you're aware that what the law said, when you kill somebody, you're going to be held accountable. There's going to be a system of justice set up, and if you're guilty, you're punished. Jesus is saying it's not just if you take another person's life, but if you're angry with your brother in your heart, you're going to be held to a judgment before me. And so going on from there, still in Matthew 5, verse 22, the second little section, it says, "Whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' will be liable to the council." Now that word council there is the word Sanhedrin, which is kind of like, would be the equivalent of the Supreme Court. It's like the highest court in Israel. And so when he says, "Whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,'" Raca was an Aramaic word, and it meant worthless, foolish, empty-headed, someone who's of no value, implied no value to God. So when you are saying to your brother, "Raca," it's not like he says about anger. When you're angry with your brother, there could be a time where it's actually the wrath of God, not the wrath of man, and you might be vindicated. But you will be held accountable. You will have your day in court, if you will. You are liable to judgment. But if you call your brother worthless to God, if you say to your brother, "Raca," in some sense, you're already guilty. You've already been found guilty. You're not just liable to judgment. You're actually standing before the Supreme Court. The only reason you'd be before the Sanhedrin is if you've already been found guilty of something. If you're like when they were going to execute Jesus, it's like they wanted to put him to death. And so it's like if we had he not had any wrongdoing, we wouldn't have had him here. They already had the accusation of blasphemy against him. And so in their mind, in some sense, he was already guilty. And Jesus is saying, when you say to your brother, "Raca," it's the next step up from just being angry with your brother, because it's a slander. It's a slander to say to your brother that you are worthless to God. No one who is redeemed, no one who's the Lord's, is worthless to him. He values every single one of his saints. And so for you to say to your brother, "Raca," you're going, how does he phrase it? Liable to the Supreme Court, liable to the council, liable to the Sanhedrin. So angry, you're judged. "Raca," you're already in a sense guilty. But then let's read the next verse. And this verse has two words in it that we're going to spend a good deal of time on. You'll notice we're only really getting through two verses on this section. It's because of how dense this next verse is, or this next part of a verse is. "And whoever says, 'Mora,' will be liable to the fiery Gehenna." Now, if you're following along in your own Bible, you might notice some different words in your translation, depending on which one you're using. Some translations will even translate the word "Raca" as, fool or empty-headed or worthless. But the reason why it leaves it as "Raca," or many translations, including mine, leave it as "Raca," is because Matthew is writing in Greek, and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, he's translating what Jesus said into Greek for the reader. But here he probably leaves the original word that Jesus said. Jesus was probably speaking Aramaic. So when he says "Raca" and leaves it untranslated, we do that also in English. We're translating the Greek into English, but we leave the untranslated Aramaic words untranslated. So when he says, "Whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' we leave it as "Raca." similar to where Jesus is on the cross and he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It's like, why does our Bible not translate that? It just leaves it untranslated. It's because it's a different language than what it was, the rest of the book was written in. And so when we translate it from Greek to English, we leave the Aramaic section untranslated the way that the Greek was. Now, there is a Greek word, mora, which is very similar to, has a very similar meaning to the word raka, means fool or, stupid, which is why most translations will translate, and whoever says to his brother, you fool, or actually the to his brother is not there, that's in the previous section, but whoever says, you fool, but there's a problem. Fool and raka would be very similar, but the judgment that he mentions are very different. One's far more extreme than the other. My understanding is that when he says, whoever says mora, he's not saying the Greek word mora, which we would translate as fool, but there's an Aramaic word, mora, which when it is, like I did leave it, well, I left it untranslated the same way as with raka, but what it means is rebel. You're not just raka, useless to God, but you're mora. You're actually at enmity with God. You are opposed to God. It's kind of like what Moses said to Korah in his rebellion. He's like, "Hear now, you rebels." And actually, it's what he said at Meribah too, when the people were grumbling, and he accused them of being rebels. He accused them of being opposed to God, not just worthless to God, which is a step worse. If it's a slander to say to your brother raka, it's an even worse slander to say mora, if it's an Aramaic word, as I think it is. So whoever says to his brother mora or rebel, Jesus is talking about something even more severe. But then there's another word that you probably have different in your Bible too, depending on your translation. Whoever says mora will be liable to the fiery Gehenna. And we'll probably spend the rest of our time just on that word. Most translations will translate that with the word hell, the English word hell, Hell. And there's a reason why they do that. When we see other usages of the word Gehenna in the New Testament, one of the more famous ones is in Mark chapter 9. Jesus is saying, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, for it is better to you to enter life crippled than with two hands to go to Gehenna, to the unquenchable fire. And so when modern readers hear the word hell, they think unquenchable fire. And in that passage in Mark, it links those two, Gehenna and unquenchable fire. There are a couple other places where it talks about fire, not unquenchable, but it'll say eternal fire in Matthew 24, to the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. In that same passage, he says, those on my left go into eternal punishment. So if you have unquenchable fire, that sounds similar to the eternal fire, which is linked with the eternal punishment, which is what modern Christians think of as hell. The other place where it uses fire famously, where we think of as hell, is Revelation chapter 20, where he says the beast and the false prophet were cast into the lake of fire. The dragon was cast into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet were, and then all those whose names were not found in the book of life were cast into the lake of fire. And so if those things are connected, the eternal fire of Matthew 24, the eternal judgment of Matthew 24, and the lake of fire in Revelation 20, then perhaps the unquenchable fire of Mark 9 is one and the same. And so they'll translate Gehenna as hell because people think of hell as being eternal fire, eternal judgment, lake of fire. But there's a problem with that interpretation, in my opinion. And there's a reason why I leave it untranslated. I just leave it with the proper noun Gehenna, because I think Jesus was using it as a proper noun. meaning it's a physical place, almost like a city. And it has a name, and its name is Gehenna. And his original hearers would have understood exactly what he was saying, because they would have known where Gehenna was. It's a valley just on the south side of Jerusalem. And so when Jesus says Gehenna, I personally don't think he's talking about the same exact thing as he's talking about in Matthew 24 when he says the eternal fire or the eternal judgment, nor Revelation 20 when he talks about the lake of fire. And we actually spent a good bit of time looking at that word hell and the different ways that it's used in the New Testament, because it's used to translate not just the word Gehenna, but it's used to translate two other words also. It's used to translate the word Hades and the word Tartarus. Now, both Hades and Tartarus are terms that were borrowed from Greek mythology. Hades was the abode of the dead, of dead men, dead human beings, where Tartarus was where the Titans were held in captivity. The Titans were like a supernatural race, kind of like the gods, but they had a big war with the gods in Greek mythology, and the gods won, and they bound them in Tartarus. And so in the New Testament, when the word Tartarus is used, most modern translations will translate it with hell. It's when it's talking about the judgment of the angels. So God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus. And then when it talks about where dead men are, like the story of rich man and Lazarus from Luke, he says he was in Hades. And oftentimes that's also translated hell. But hell, in that sense, the Hades hell, can't be the same thing as the lake of fire. Because we read in Revelation 20, death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. So how can the lake of fire be cast into the lake of fire? It doesn't make sense. And so he's talking about something else when he talks about Hades. He's talking about something else, it seems, when he's talking about Tartarus. But in my opinion, he's talking about something else also when he talks about Gehenna. Jesus is not the only one who uses the phrase Gehenna. Now, the word Gehenna literally just means the valley of Henna, or the valley of Hinnom. Multiple times in the Old Testament, really 3 times throughout in the book of Jeremiah, that phrase, the valley of, and they actually, it's slightly different, they say the valley of the son of Hinnom. But you can tell it's talking about the same place. It's talking about this valley on the south side of Jerusalem. And it was a specific place of eschatological judgment. It was a place where, at the end of days, the wicked from the nation of Israel will specifically be judged. In Jeremiah 7, he says, starting in verse 30, "For the sons of Judah have done evil in my sight, declares the Lord. They have set their detestable things in the house that is called by my name to defile it. And they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom." Another way of saying Gehenna. And what did they do there? "To burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. Therefore the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. For they will bury in Topheth, because there is no room elsewhere, and the dead bodies of this people, will be food for the birds of the air and for the beasts of the earth, and none will frighten them away." Turning also to Isaiah chapter 66, verse 24, "And they will go out and look on the dead bodies of the men who have rebelled against me, for there worm shall not die, and the fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh." That's the unquenchable fire Jesus is talking about when he's talking about Gehenna. It's not the lake of fire in eternity future. It's the end times judgment on specifically the rebellious among the nation of Israel. And we can get into much more detail about this next time, and we will, when Jesus is talking about how to handle when there's anger and dispute between you and your brother, and what potential judgment will come. But it can create confusion when it's translated as hell, because we know the only reason that human beings were cast into the lake of fire, according to Revelation 20, was because their name was not found in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world. Not because they were angry with their brother, they called their brother a fool, or that they called their brother a rebel, if I'm understanding that correctly. No, what Jesus is talking about is a judgment on his people, something that you as a disciple of Jesus will be held accountable to and potentially experience. Not the lake of fire, but an eschatological disciplinary judgment of his people. And like I said, we'll talk about what that means more specifically next time. But I think the main principle that we wanted to see is Jesus' attitude towards his people and their attitudes toward one another. I believe it was C.S. Lewis. He said, nothing that you encounter in your daily life is of eternal value, save the other people that you're with. Right? And so the attitude that you have towards your brother when you're angry with him, Jesus takes that so seriously because his people are so precious to him. Like he said to the Apostle Paul, who was persecuting the Christians, when Jesus appears to him, he says, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Not my people, but me. Like Jesus identifies himself with his people. And so when you're angry with your brother, you think, oh, he's just a jerk, I don't care about him. No, you're going to be liable to judgment. That's going to be for you on the day of judgment, similar to how the murderer was under the law in the nation of Israel. The ancients were told, when you murder, you're liable to judgment. But I say to you, your anger against your brother. And if you slander your brother, if you call him worthless when he's not worthless, or even worse, when you lie about him saying he's at enmity with me, that's a severe judgment that you're going to face, because I take how my people are treated very seriously. And so, like I said, next time we're going to look at the rest of this passage where Jesus talks about when your brother has offense against you, how to be reconciled and how important it is to be reconciled. And we'll look a little bit more on what that judgment means that he's warning about, the judgment of Gehenna. So look forward to talking with you about that next time. Thanks.